Good evening, everyone. Before we begin tonight's show, I wanted to give a special shout out to my friend TJ Lee and his podcast. TJ is a well-known writer in the horror community, and he hosts a podcast called The Writer's Mythos. In each episode, TJ, with the help of expert voice actors and the musical stylings of No Sleep's very own Mr. Brandon Boone, they explore the work and lives of some of horror's most important writers. It's essential listening for anyone interested in the horror genre, so please do check out The Writer's Mythos, leave a review and tell them we said hi. Hello and welcome to Talking Till Dawn. I'm Michael Whitehouse and I'm joined by the ever-menacing Mr. Martin Yates.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good.
Sorry, that wasn't a very menacing introduction.
No. Hello, how are you? No, I don't know.
There's no way to say that. Well, maybe there is a creepy way to say that. How you doing?
No.
Hello, how are you?
I know. No, that just sounds like you're chatting me up now, man.
Yeah.
Which I kind of like.
Now that's creepy.
Yeah. So, before we begin tonight's show, we wanted to thank all of our patrons, especially the ones that have just joined at patreon.com/Talking Till Dawn.
Yeah, hello to Yukol, Andre Simpson, and Chuck Stugans. Thank you very much. Hopefully I've not mispronounced any of those names, but thank you very much for all your support. It really, really means a lot, and it helps us with hosting and everything else. It's vastly, vastly appreciated. We are a small independent podcast, and every little helps. We value all of our listeners. There's absolutely no pressure on anyone to contribute financially. We appreciate every one of you, but thank you very much to you three guys for pledging.
Yeah, so a big thanks to everyone who's supporting us so far. It's really gratifying to see people willing to help the show out. Okay, so Martin, both of us enjoy a good urban legend.
We certainly do.
And I think our listeners seem like the type of solid, inquiring folks who would enjoy that too. There's nothing quite like having someone tell you an eerie story about something that happened to them, a family member, or a friend of a friend. These stories are usually clothed in all the trappings of reality. They often begin with something along the lines of, "This really happened," or "I knew someone who had a strange experience once." I've started a few short stories myself like that. The story unfolds, usually taking us from the humdrum of normal life into the twisted shadows of conjecture and imagination. It's especially enjoyable when you're told these stories in suitable surroundings, sitting by a campfire perhaps, or lit by candlelight as you pass through the late hours of a power cut with loved ones. In fact, it's the latter that affected me the most. I can remember when I was a kid on more than one occasion when the power went out in our street. Our house was a bit of an epicentre for people. So a few of our neighbours who were like extended family to us came through with their kids, some of whom were similar ages to me and my brother, and then sat with our family waiting for the lights to come back on. We'd light candles and have torches in our hands. That's flashlights, everyone, on the other side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, you weren't going to burn somebody's house down.
Yeah, persecute a well-intentioned monster. In that glow, we'd laugh and tell jokes and keep the mood light, but as a 7 or 8 year old kid, I could feel what some of them were really thinking. Of course, the adults knew that the lights would come back on, but there's always that little splinter of doubt sticking into us, isn't there? That something bad has happened, that the lights won't come back on,
Certainly in
that
childhood.
will be left there in the dark.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Even as an adult, it's happened to me before, where like entire streets have went out, and there's that little bit of you that's like, this is strange. Worse still, as everyone chatted back then, I would look out of our window that showed Glasgow's orange city lights in abundance in the valley below, spreading out towards the mountains for miles. And then I'd have that thought, what if it's just us? It's just our street that's in the dark. The rest of the world continues on where we're engulfed by the night. I'd be sitting there thinking, something's wrong here, something's about to happen.
Surely you could just go up
Yeah.
the road. Surely it's worse if you looked out and the whole of Glasgow was in darkness. That's got to be creepier. That's got to be worse.
Probably, but there's something about, it's like if all your friends were going to a party and you weren't,
Yeah.
and you'd be like, so like the rest of the world continues on.
Is this like the spooky version of FOMO?
Yes. Yeah, I remember sitting there on more than one occasion, but I'm thinking of one in particular. I remember sitting there during a power cut, and I could feel like that similar nervousness amongst my neighbours, just as unnerved that our lives had come to a standstill just for a few hours. Now I would imagine it would be even worse, so like no internet, no social media to fall out with each other on. Whatever would we do, Martin?
Oh yeah, read a book.
Yeah.
Have a conversation.
Exactly. So during those few times we had those power cuts, I would wait for someone to say something about that feeling of dread that I sort of felt as a cosy dread. It would come, but not in the way I'd expect. All it would take was for someone to say, "This is a bit spooky," and then we were off. Stories would be told, and in a bizarre way they made me feel better. There was a coziness to listening to these terrible tales, and some of them were terrible because they were frightening, some of them were just plain terrible. But each one was invariably presented as an urban legend.
Yeah.
Something that had actually happened. So look out.
Yeah.
This has happened to someone else, it could happen to you. In some ways, Talking Till Dawn feels like an extension of those times. Some very fond memories for me, and another reason for me becoming a writer eventually. Stories have a power to them, and frightening ones are cathartic.
Yeah, definitely. And I should actually jump in and just say, if anyone feels the same way and likes that whole idea of people sitting around telling scary stories, you should check out the latest episode of the Fit's Been Happening podcast, because I guested on it last night. I think the episode's out now already. That's the 26th of May 2021. We had a really good chat with the guys on there. Great couple of guys. They've had some great guests on in the past. Not saying I wasn't a good guest, but
I bet you were. I bet you were a belter.
yeah, I don't know. I'm no Dominic Diamond, Michael. They had Dominic Diamond on before me. But yeah, no, do check that out. They're really funny couple of guys. Great podcast. I had a blast sitting up telling spooky stories with them. So if you get a chance, do. In fact, make time. Go and check out Fit's Been Happening podcast, episode Martin Yates. I'm the title of the episode, Michael. It's beautiful.
Beautiful. Finally it's all happening. I'll be checking that out as well, mate. I'm looking forward to listening to it. So when I was sitting there in that power cut listening to those stories, and everyone was taking turns telling these urban legends, they were just stories.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's what I thought. There wasn't anything real about them. But well, if you've listened to our Christmas themed episode about the Santa Claus chimney urban legend, you'll know that some of these stories have a grain of truth to them, and then there are others that are shockingly close to what actually happened. So I hope, Martin, you and our listeners forgive me that tangent into a memory from my past, but it was one of the first times I became aware of stories like these.
If we didn't enjoy your tangents into the past, there would be no podcast, Michael. We would be out of a job.
70% tangent. So tonight I would like to tell you, Martin, and our listeners a few of these stories, and then we can dive into the truth behind them.
Do it.
I should say as well, there are so many of these that I'm certain we'll do several of these urban legend episodes over the years. Maybe there'll be ones that you want to do episodes about as well, Martin.
100%. And again, this is actually on similar ground to some of the stuff I was talking about last night, so that's good. I'm still in that headspace. I'm looking forward to this.
Excellent. So Let's start with one of the stories my dad told during one of those power cuts. It always stayed with me, and it's just a short one, so I don't know the name of the Barbers where this took place, but of course when my dad told the story,
Sweeney Todd.
Well, we're going to get there, Martin. It took place in the one where I used to get my hair cut as a boy. That's at least the story that he used to tell me. The story was that the owner of this barber shop had been under a lot of pressure. His business wasn't doing well, and the banks were threatening to repossess his shop. He started drinking heavily during this period, and that was when the first glimpse of his instability showed. On more than one occasion, some of the other barbers that worked for him caught him talking to someone in the back of the shop. The problem was, there was no one there. Now, as my dad put it, the mind is a fragile thing, and when stresses mount, all that's required is one push, and that can take anyone into a complete breakdown. Suddenly, someone who seemed to have everything together just loses the plot completely. In the barber's case, it came in the form of betrayal. A close friend of his, we'll call him Mark, was secretly having an affair with the barber's wife. One morning, the barber found letters between his wife and his friend. They were going to run off together. Now, the barber was a quiet type of person, and he seemed to hold in his rage. Instead, he quietly went to work. He served several customers throughout the day, until that is, a man came in and sat in the barber's chair.
You don't want a haircut off a guy whose mind is on his best friend and his wife having an affair. That is not how you get a good haircut. That's how you come out of there with like your ear missing and like half shaved head. The guy's mind's not on the job.
Yeah. So,
always look them in the eye and try and work out before you sit in that chair. Is he worried about his wife having an affair?
Are his hands shaking?
Yeah.
As fate would have it, it gets worse. The man that had walked into the shop was the barber's friend, Mark.
Oh, wow.
Who had the audacity to come in for a free haircut, Martin. A free haircut.
He's got to look nice for his date.
I know. You got to be perverted going in for a free haircut from the guy whose wife you're going to steal. The barber cleaned his blade, dutifully rubbed shaving cream on Mark's face, and then... I should have mentioned that he was going to get shaved at that point.
It's only one of those short back and sides.
Why are you shaving me? And then with precision began to cut Mark's throat.
Told you his mind's not on the job.
Yeah. Now, where does the real story come from? My dad worked as a mental health officer in Glasgow for decades. It was his job to assess people and decide whether they were a risk to themselves or others. If they were, and a psychiatrist was in agreement, he was able to have them detained in a psychiatric ward. My dad maintained that he knew someone who had detained the barber in question. In the true story, the person the barber attacked didn't die, so a happy ending, kind of.
Permanently disfigured. Night, kids.
I haven't been able to verify this account other than what my dad told me, but the funny thing is, the stories of a violent barber in our area where I grew up were told to me by more than one person. So this may all sound familiar to those listening. That's because there have been stories about deranged barbers going back to the accounts of Sweeney Todd, as you mentioned, Martin, the demon barber of Fleet Street. A lot of people think Sweeney Todd was really a barber from the Victorian era who killed many of his customers in London, but most historians agree that he's actually a work of melodramatic fiction. In Charles Dickens' The Pickwick Papers, serialised between 1836 to 1837, there's a servant character named Sam Weller, and he tells a story about a pie seller who used cats as pie filling and sold them off as more acceptable meat.
Right.
In 1843, Dickens expanded this idea to human beings in his book Martin Chuzzlewit, when a character called Tom Pinch mentions countless tales of pies being sold to the public containing human remains. So what does this have to do with a knife-wielding barber? Well, in most stories of Sweeney Todd, he is assisted by a woman named Mrs. Lovett. Sweeney Todd gives the bodies of his victims over to Mrs. Lovett, who then bakes their flesh into pies, which are then sold to London's unsuspecting public. Just 2 years after the story of the human pie sellers in Charles Dickens' book, the first fully fledged account of Sweeney Todd appeared in a serialised publication called The String of Pearls, a Domestic Romance. All is not lost, however, if you want to believe this story comes from a real source. Journalist Peter Haining claimed to find evidence of a barber who murdered people around 1800. While this still hasn't been verified and remains contentious among historians, I would say it's almost certain that a barber at some point has killed someone in his shop.
Oh, definitely. 100%. I think part of it as well, from a folklore point of view, especially in that time when the barber was like a regular place that guys went to all the time to get their beard done and everything, you were at their mercy. It's kind of, it's like going to the dentist or something. Even more so then, because they perform simple surgical procedures even. The white and red pole that you see outside Barbers, the red represented blood for bloodletting. So there were figures of slight fear anyway. And then you're basically going and sitting in their chair and they're waving a knife around your throat. So it's hardly surprising that there's going to be a preoccupation with that as a kind of scary situation, just as there's horror movies about dentists and mad doctors and things. The idea that there's scary stories about mad barbers makes perfect sense, especially in the time period. But also, the flip side of that is it's such an intimate job, and it does give people some degree of power over others, that, as you say, I'd be very surprised if someone hasn't taken advantage of that situation to do something nasty to someone.
And my granddad used to say the only person that you have to tip is your barber, because he's the one that holds the blade to your throat. But yeah, so someone has definitely killed someone, in a barber shop. In fact, just in 2015 in Bournemouth, a woman named Katrina O'Hara was murdered inside a barber shop, albeit by a jealous ex-lover rather than a serial-killing barber. And in 2017, Russian couple Natalia and Dmitry Bakshiv confessed to drugging, slaughtering, and then eating dozens of human victims by baking them into pies.
Christ, yeah, I remember this.
The couple stayed in a hostel near a military base in Krasnodar, South Russia. Sorry for the pronunciations, our Russian friends. They would then sell the pies to military trainees and student pilots who were training at a nearby academy. It's also been claimed that the murderous couple set themselves up as meat suppliers and sold the meat from their victims to cafes and local restaurants, serving up food to many unsuspecting customers. It's horribly grim, and of course, this took place in 2017.
But again, had that happened in a time when we didn't have, newspapers, and we didn't have 24-hour news media, this is again ties in with something I was talking about on the other podcast the other night, but elements of that almost certainly would have gone into folklore. People would have passed on those stories one to another.
Yeah.
And then 200 years later, we might be talking about a sort of completely warped, changed version, maybe mashing that together with some other stories. The other thing is, of course, what you don't want to happen is for those pilots and trainee soldiers, for it to be discovered that they actually all had a vast increase in performance after eating human meat.
Oh, yeah.
And then the military start thinking is there some way we can leverage this?
Like the old idea of cannibals taking on the powers of the people that they...
Yeah.
Yeah, so this obviously happened in 2017. If anything, it's an example of life imitating art, and in this case, the darkest side. You do have to wonder if the Bakshivs got their idea from Sweeney Todd, so I blame Johnny Depp.
Yeah.
He seems to get the blame for everything these days, so we might as well just blame him anyway. So it seems the story of either a demon barber or a cannibal pie seller has been doing the rounds as an urban legend for hundreds of years. I suspect, though, that the pie selling part is probably real. During the 1600s and 1700s, medicinal cannibalism was rife across the Western world. It's not talked about a lot, but it happened all over the place, even in America. In New England, in the late 1600s, a Puritan minister named Edward Taylor wrote, "Human blood, drunk warm and new, is held good in the falling sickness." The falling sickness is another term for epilepsy. So yeah, this was in the 1600s. Around this time, the idea of like cures like was prevalent. If you had a problem with your head, such as headaches, then drinking ground human skull with molasses was believed to solve the problem. If you had problems with your eyesight, then consuming the eyes of dead people was said to help with that. The consumption or use of human remains in medicine was recorded in England as late as the 1800s. By any historical measure, that's not that long ago. As you said, Martin, this could include human bone, fat and ligaments and other parts of the body. I was quite surprised when I read about medical cannibalism and how widespread it was just a couple of hundred years ago.
Also, mummy as in basically a powder that you could buy at the chemists, and it was literally made, or partly made, from looted Egyptian mummies that were looted from tombs in the 19th century and ground, because they were obviously like dried out and brittle, they would just grind them down in big mortars and pestle, bottle them up and sell them.
Did they inhale that? Did they snuff that?
I think you actually took a spoonful of it.
Really?
You would eat it.
Just before bed?
Yeah. The thing is, it may even have had some mild medicinal effects, because when the ancient Egyptians were mummifying people, they used all kinds of tinctures and chemicals and like bitumen and herbs, and there was like a whole chemical process involved. So at least it was believed that there was something that was imbued in those sort of dried out corpses that was beneficial to human health and was supposedly like a cure for various ailments.
Imagine being buried, and then, you know, thousands of years later, what happened to you? Did they put you in a museum? No, they ground me down and ate me.
That's true. That is true. It's funny because I guess to people at that time it was like, if everyone's doing it, it almost like normalizes it a lot. Like it's not really people, is it? It's mummies from ancient Egypt. It's almost like there's a disconnect there. It's like,
God, it's the ultimate colonialism, isn't it? It's the ultimate.
That's a great point. Yeah, definitely. And at the same time that's happening, there's a huge amount of anxiety about grave robbing and stuff here. Like in graves, you know, people digging up bodies and selling them to the medical industry, that kind of thing. And meanwhile, the medical industry and people are buying bits of bodies just from longer ago and literally eating them for some supposed health benefits.
Was there a picture of Boris Karloff on the bottle? Should have been, or Christopher Lee maybe.
I think if you look up, hold on, I'm sure you can see
powdered Boris Karloff.
Mummy powder bottle. The thing is, look up mummy powder bottle, you get a lot of things about baby, like powdered milk and stuff. Here we go. Yeah, you could buy it right up until 1924.
Yeah.
Was the last, until relatively recently. German pharmaceutical company Merck & Co. in 1924 was one of the last to still have mummy powder on the list of products for sale in its catalogues.
Amazing.
So that's like after my grandparents were born.
Yeah. Medical cannibalism is an entire episode in its own right, so I'll move on for now. Consider what we've covered so far an appetizer.
Well done.
I wish I'd said that in Vincent Price's voice. Consider what we've covered so far as an appetizer.
No, you just sound like you're performing in the birdcage or something.
Okay, so I'll leave the last comment on these urban legends of pie eaters and barbers to a quote that was published on May 3rd, 1718 by the British Gazetteer, and this was found on a blog from Dr. Lindsay Fitzharris. We have intelligence from Lincoln that a man being hanged there at the last assizes, within 3 days after his execution, a couple of apothecaries contracted with a butcher for a sum of money to take the body out of the grave and cut off all the flesh, fit for them to make a skeleton of, which flesh he sold for venison to an innkeeper, who, making it into a pasty, invited many of his neighbours to the eating of it. But some time after the villainy being detected, the butcher and the two apothecaries were committed to Lincoln jail. Yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. Just seemed to be a lot of people getting put into pies, Martin.
Yeah. It does, again, like the barber thing, I guess it plays into an anxiety that people have about another profession that is something very personal to themselves and involves their bodies, and that is the people who sell them their food. And I guess we've always had a little bit of anxiety about what's in our food and where we're getting it from. And
Yeah.
when it's out of our sight, what, is the guy at McDonald's hawking a big greener into our
Well, that's it.
Big Mac?
Back then it must have been even worse because there must have been so much food poisoning.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that, it was an intimate thing. Someone that prepared food for you was something that had to be trusted.
I've come across wild conspiracy theories on Twitter that McDonald's are selling human flesh and all this kinds of nonsense.
Really?
And people still gobble that up. Not to put too fine a point on it, people still love those kinds of stories. There's something about that
And the burgers.
And the burgers. There's something about that people love that just really presses their buttons, that scares them, but they love to share these kind of gross out stories about things that are in our food. So yeah, I mean, that's hardly surprising that those stories have spread, and it's not surprising that it's happened as well.
Yeah. So let's now turn our attention to some other urban legends. Have you heard the tale of the leaping lawyer?
I don't think I have.
This one originated in Canada and soon spread to the United States. It's even been told in London as well. It takes place in a big city. The myth goes that there was a big shot lawyer who had an office in a skyscraper. One day he was speaking with a group of young student lawyers. During this meeting, he decided to show the students how to put their faith in something, be it to the system, themselves, or something else. To do this, the lawyer stated that he would run full force into one of the room's windows.
I have heard this.
Believing it would withstand the impact. And it did, the first time. The second time he did it, not so much. The window didn't break, but the entire frame popped out and he plummeted to the ground, dying from his injuries. This story did the rounds for a while, but it can actually be traced back to a Toronto-based lawyer named Gary Hoy. Apparently,
Which is what he shouted as he went out the window. Hoy!
Hoy! That's terrible. We're talking about a dead man here, man. Apparently, Gary had been doing this trick in front of new recruits to the firm where he worked. Although it's not explicitly stated in the...
He's been slowly working the window out of the frame every time.
Although it's not explicitly stated in the records.
It's not funny.
Surrounding this incident, you do wonder if it was the same window he'd been doing this to for a long time. And that finally, the window just gave in. Not intentionally, of course, unless you believe in the malice of inanimate objects. That's a VMR James reference. Interestingly, apparently Gary Hoy's death contributed to his entire law firm going bust. Holden Day Wilson lost 30 lawyers over a 3-year period after Gary's death, some suggesting this is because people lost their faith in the entire enterprise. Gary was one of the company's senior partners at the time. So he brought down like a pretty major law firm with his japery.
It's awful, right? Don't get me. I mean, that's a guy with a family and stuff like it. Should not be laughing. But like, you are telling it in the same way that urban legend has been told and passed around, and it almost doesn't seem like it's a real person. And I know you're telling me that it did actually happen. Obviously, there is that disconnect when it's just like, this is a story that occurred. But when you really think about it, it's tragic. The guy's trying to train new recruits and have like a fun sort of training procedure. And it's gone horribly wrong.
You can't help but imagine a Wolf of Wall Street scenario where the lawyers get white powder all over his face. He's running, screaming at this window.
Now we're making insinuations of hard drug use.
No, I'm not. I know listen, it is tragic, but this is a story. I'm not going to do my Fresh Prince of Bel-Air joke there. This is a story that's been told over and over and over again, and it's kind of taken on a life of its own. It's had many pieces added to it and taken away from it, but that's where the kernel of the story comes from Gary Hoy's tragic death.
Poor guy.
When I was reading about this urban legend, it reminded me of that one about the businessman in his office. His wife is undergoing a serious operation with a 5% chance of survival. The operation is supposed to finish before 3 p.m. The businessman has instructed the doctor to only phone if it's good news. 3 p.m. comes and there's no phone call. The businessman waits another 2 hours, sitting by the phone, hoping beyond hope that his wife is still alive. When 5 p.m. comes, he stands up from his desk and decides he doesn't want to live anymore, so he jumps out the window, and as he plummets to the ground, he hears the phone ringing in his office above. So that's the story. I've heard a few variations of that, but
how would you know that? How would you know that? Because if he's dead when he hits the ground,
yeah, exactly. It's not, that one's obviously not true, unless that story was told by the doctor later. It was like, I did phone. So there's another fascinating urban legend about a famous murder trial that involves a jump from a window. A man named Ronald Opus wrote a suicide note. Have you heard this one?
I don't know yet.
A man named Ronald Opus wrote a suicide note specifically saying that he was going to kill himself. He climbed out onto the ledge of his building and jumped from 10 stories up. As he fell, someone on the 9th floor fired a shotgun, killing Ronald Opus on the way down.
As he fell past the window.
Yeah. The problem is that neither Ronald nor the person with the gun knew that there was a safety net that had been installed below, and he would have more than likely survived the fall. So it gets even more weird. It turns out that the person who fired the shotgun was an elderly man who often threatened his wife with the gun during arguments. However, the elderly man always knew that the gun wasn't loaded. He was so angry with his wife that he couldn't keep the gun steady, and it went off by accident, missing the wife and killing Ronald Opus. So how did the gun end up loaded? Well, it turns out that the son of the elderly man knew that he used the shotgun in this way during these arguments, and the son wanted his mother dead, and so he secretly loaded the gun, hoping that it would go off during one of their arguments, killing the mother and sending the father to prison. Now, here's the last twist in the tale. It turns out that Ronald Opus, the man who jumped from the window and was accidentally shot on the way down, was the son. He had loaded the gun and, in a bizarre twist of fate, inadvertently caused his own death.
Did kill himself. But wait, was this not in a film? Was this not, like, was it not Magnolia or something that they told this story?
Yeah, I don't know if it was mentioned in that, but not that I wish anyone dead, but it is kind of disappointing that this one has no truth to it. It's actually a fictional case dreamed up by Don Harper Mills, a pathologist. It's supposed to illustrate the difficulties in attributing blame during such an event.
It was, so Don Harper Mills says, Ronald Opus says the incident has been adapted for various media, notably the Paul Thomas Anderson film Magnolia, in which the protagonist is reimagined as Sidney Barringer. So, yeah, I had heard it before, but yeah.
I thought it sounded familiar when I was reading about it. You didn't come here for fake urban legends, man. Let's get to some more that turned out to be true. Back in the early mid-2000s, there was an urban legend spreading on the internet. Actually, before I start this, I should say, some of the urban legends that have kernels of truth to them that I'm about to go into now, the next stories that I'm going to talk about, some of them have a lot of violence and some discussion of molestation, and so if you're affected by those sorts of things, you may want to skip the rest of the podcast. Okay, so back in the early to mid-2000s, there was an urban legend spreading on the internet and around certain parts of the US. The story goes that children were starting to hear footsteps creeping along the hallway to their rooms. If you were unlucky enough to be one of those children, you would hear the footsteps stop at your bedroom door. Then the door would silently open and a light would enter the room. A solitary candle, in fact, held by the quiet figure of a man. The man stands and waits. He watches the child, waiting for a sign that they are awake. The child implicitly knows that they can't scream, they can't call for their parents to come to the rescue, because by the time they would reach the bedroom it would be too late. The best chance the child has in this situation is to keep his or her eyes shut tight and pray that the man holding the candle doesn't suspect they're awake. The child lies there for hours, and just as the sun rises, the child hears the slightest creak from the doorway. The man is gone. When the child finally cries out for his or her parents, they are forced to believe that someone was indeed standing, watching over their child through the night, because hardened droplets of candle wax can be seen on the floor. The man is never caught, and he continues to prey on children in this way. And what happens if the children don't remain silent? Well, they don't live to see the dawn. So this is known as the Candlelight Prowler urban legend. And you know what I'm going to say to you, Martin? It is based on a real event.
Jesus.
Only in the true story, the Prowler was eventually caught. Not only that, but he attacked and molested children. His name is Darren James MacDonald, and he was sentenced to 7 years in jail in Australia for breaking into people's houses. For some reason, he used a candle to light his way, which seems very odd to me. In one of these houses, he found 2 young girls asleep in their beds, woke them up, and sexually assaulted both of them.
Jesus Christ.
7 years just doesn't seem long enough, does it?
He only got 7 years.
He only gets 7 years, yeah. Crazy.
So, like, how... I mean, now, one child's too much, obviously, but how extensive were his crimes? Was it just that one incident? Was it like the story he did this habitually?
I genuinely don't know. I would imagine... I mean, I would have thought for one of those crimes, you'd get a hell of a lot more than 7
Of course,
years,
yeah, no, yeah, of course. I don't mean to sound like... I don't mean to sound like 7 years is right for one, but what I mean is... just in terms of like trying to work out how accurate the urban legend is versus the true version. Did the urban legend just grow out of like a single incident?
Yeah.
Or did the urban legend grow out of someone who was doing this habitually? I guess we don't know, but presumably he was only convicted of those ones. But
yeah, I'm not sure, but I have no idea what happened to the man, but that was back in the early 2000s, so he would have served his sentence by now.
Yeah, Jesus.
Which is a terrifying thought. So the Candlelight Prowler is a good example of how urban legends have a kernel of truth at their core. Then, as people pass the story around, they eventually take on a mimetic quality. They become far removed from the original incident, evolving over time. As an aside to this, there was a good example of how information is increasingly being turned on its head and almost sort of mutating from its original source. Just the other day, there's a horror creator called Andrew Bowser, who I'm a big fan of. Some of you might be aware of his podcast with Jessica Chobot, The Untold Hour, which was previously Bizarre States. Anyway, Andrew has a character he portrays called Onyx the Fortuitous. Recently, he did an entire live stream of himself making a video on YouTube of his process for making a video for TikTok. So he did an entire live stream of this. And they're always sort of comedy videos. So people on TikTok had started making these videos where they would mime being shot, and every time they take a bullet, text appears with that bullet or where that bullet would impact, and the text reads what that sort of wound represents. So his character would take an imaginary bullet and it would be something like, my dad says I can't borrow his car, or that's the sort of joke. Like, they would be like things that are completely low level, but to him they were really really
first world
hurtful.
Problem kind of
thing.
Yeah.
So that's the joke, that the apparent pains are minuscule in the face of life's greater tragedy. But he quickly took down the TikTok video and the full live stream of making it within hours, because it turns out that the meme came from someone who did the same sort of video, but each time they took a symbolic bullet, it was something truly awful that had actually happened to them, like being molested. So he never realised that when he was making the videos. It was after he did that live stream and put that video up that people were like, by the way, you might not want to make fun of this meme. It had become something else, and it had been so removed from what the original thing was. So urban legends have kind of had that same underlying quality of being transformed from the original source over and over, and in many ways they're kind of a prototype for the way information is being used now at accelerated speeds through social media. Let's get back to another urban legend, one of my absolute favourites. A family wakes up one night and hears their son talking to someone in his room. The father gets up and walks through to the room to see what's going on. The son is sitting in bed and talking to something curled up next to him.
What's the matter, Michael? It's a monster that came out of my wall.
Yeah. To the father's horror, he realises that it's a tiny baby alligator. The boy found it while playing outside earlier that day and brought it up to his room. The father is angry with his son, chastises him, then grabs the alligator, puts it down the toilet and flushes it away. But the alligator doesn't die. Years later, sewer workers working under a road in the same city suddenly see something in the darkness swimming towards them. Its eyes are yellow and its mouth is wide open with hundreds of white serrated teeth. The sewer workers run for their lives, but one of them is taken by the beast beneath the putrid water. This is one of my favourites for two reasons. The first is, and it's another personal story, that I remember watching the 1980 monster movie Alligator with my dad late one night. I haven't seen it in many years, but it essentially has the same setup. A surly father flushes a baby alligator down the pan, and then years later it starts to feed on people from the sewers. There's a mad scientist angle to the film. The alligator grows far larger than normal because it's feeding on the carcasses of discarded research animals pumped full of growth hormones. But the second reason that I love this urban legend is I remember asking my dad if it was possible, and he was all, "No, son, the alligator wouldn't survive down there." It reminds me of the line Newt says in Aliens about her parents telling her there were no such things as real monsters. Because that's right, alligators living in the sewers are a real thing.
Yeah. They are, but mostly only in warm places, right? Mostly only in places that would have alligators at the surface, right?
You think so, but hold on. On the 9th of February 1935, the New York Times ran a story with the headline, "Alligator Found in Uptown Sewer." And I'm just going to quickly read that article to you, if that's alright.
Please do.
Alligator found in Uptown Sewer. Youths shoveling snow into manhole see the animal churning in icy water. Snare it and drag it out. Reptile slain by rescuers when it gets vicious. Whence it came is a mystery. Love it. Love it. The youthful residents of East 123rd Street, near the murky Harlem River, were having a rather grand time at dusk yesterday, shoveling the last of the recent snow into a gaping manhole. Salvatore Condalucci, 16 years old, of 419 East 123rd Street, was assigned to the rim. His comrades would heap blackened slush near him, and he, carefully observing the sewer's capacity, would give the last fine flick to each mound. Suddenly there were signs of clogging 10 feet below, where the manhole drop merged with the dark conduit leading to the river. Salvatore yelled, "Hey you guys!" Not literally, he says, "Hey you guys, wait a minute," and got down on his knees to see what was the trouble. What he saw in the thickening dusk almost caused him to topple into the icy cavern, for the jagged surface of the ice blockade below was moving, and something black was breaking through. Salvatore's eyes widened. Then he managed to leap to his feet and call his friends. "Honest, it's an alligator," he exploded. That's a strange way of putting it. Salvatore then exploded.
Then he exploded.
Others look and are convinced. That's a subheading. There was a murmur of scepticism. Jimmy Marino, 19 of 440 East 123rd Street, shouldered his way to the rim and stared. "He's right," he said. Frank Lonzo, 18 of 1743 Park Avenue, looked next. A lot of addresses in this. He also confirmed the spectre. Then there was a great crush about the opening in the middle of the street, and heads were bent low around the aperture. The animal apparently was threshing about in the ice, trying to get clear. When the first wave of awe had passed, the boys decided to help it out. A delegation was dispatched to the Lehigh Stove and Repair Shop at 441 East 123rd Street. "We want some clothesline," demanded the delegation, and they got it. Young Condalucci, an expert on Western movies, fashioned a slip knot. With the others watching breathlessly, he dangled the noose into the sewer, and after several tantalising near catches, looked at about the gator's neck. Then he pulled hard. There was a grating of rough leathery skin against jumbled ice, but the job was too much for one youth. The others grabbed the rope and all pulled. Slowly, with its curving tail twisting weakly, the animal was dragged from the snow 10 feet through the dank cavern and to the street, where it lay, non-committal. It was not in Florida, that was clear, and therefore, when one of the boys sought to loosen the rope, the creature opened its jaws and snapped, not with the robust vigour of a healthy, well-sunned alligator, but with the fury of a sick, very badly treated one. The boys jumped back. Curiosity and sympathy turned to enmity. "Let him have it," the cry went up. So the shovels that had been used to pile snow on the alligator's head were now to rain blows upon it. The gator's tail swished about a few last times. Its jaws clashed weakly, but it was in no mood for a real struggle after its icy incarceration. It died on the spot.
Poor thing.
I know. Triumphantly, but not without the inevitable reaction of sorrow. The boys took their victim to the Lehigh Stove and Repair Shop. There it was found to weigh 125 pounds. They said it measured 7.5 or 8 feet. It became at once the greatest attraction the store ever had had. The whole neighbourhood milled about, and finally a call for the police reached a nearby station. But there was little for the hurrying policeman to do. The strange visitor was quite dead, and no charge could be preferred against it or against its slayers. The neighbours were calmed with a little trouble, and speculation as to where the gator had come from was rife. There were no pet shops in the vicinity. That theory was ruled out almost at once. Finally, the theory simmered down to that of a passing boat. Plainly, a steamer from the mysterious Everglades, or thereabouts, had been passing 123rd Street, and the alligator had fallen overboard. Shunning the hatefully cold water, it had swum toward shore and found only the entrance to the conduit. That sounds like something out of science fiction. Then, after another 150 yards through a torrent of melting snow, and by that time it was half dead, it had arrived under the open manhole. Half dead, yes, the neighbourhood conceded, but still alive enough for a last splendid opening and snapping of its jaws. The boys were ready to swear to that. At about 9 p.m, when tired mothers had succeeded in getting most of their alligator-conscious youngsters to bed, a Department of Sanitation truck rumbled up to the store and made off with the prize. Its destination was Barren Island and an incinerator. There we have it.
It's interesting. I think as well that a lot of reptiles can go into like a torpid state when it's cold, so they can survive for quite a long time without activity or without eating. But then I guess you think sewers probably are an awful lot warmer than the open river. They don't really freeze. People are emptying baths, washing dishes. There's dishwashers and washing machines pumping water down into sewers all the time. That's going to be warm water. So yeah, maybe obviously this did happen, but maybe it's possible for there to be a viable population somewhere, you know. You
don't need to go back nearly 100 years to find this.
Was that how far? Sorry, I was just going to ask that. When was this?
1935.
Okay.
Here's a video, Martin, from 2016.
Right.
We'll put it in the show notes.
I don't have an alligator in my sewer.
So this is clearly Florida or somewhere, though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just when you thought you'd seen everything.
I imagine that happens quite a lot in Florida, I have to say.
So a man is looking into a drain that goes under a street into a sewer. Like I say, I'll leave a link to the video. There is a huge alligator staring at him from the water, and the hiss it lets out is terrifying. These animals reach upwards of 4.5 metres or 14.7 feet. No thank you very much. If I ever visit America and if I have to go toilet, I don't know, I'll work out some sort of system.
I've seen them before.
Yeah, because you went to Florida, didn't you?
Yeah, it's funny because you think, scary alligators, but when you're there and you see one, look, there's an alligator, it just seems normal. It's just there's some wildlife, unless you go up and stick your head in its face or something silly like that. I think you're okay. It's finding them where they shouldn't be. That's when they become scary. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah,
like
absolutely.
It's not scary, right? Not like, oh my god, I'm not going to sleep tonight. But there's something unsettling about the idea of finding something where it shouldn't be, something out of place.
Yeah.
Like that. It's a little bit like when me and Callum went to Inchconnecan and Loch Lomond to see the wallabies.
Yeah.
Because there's an island in Loch Lomond where there's a population of feral wallabies. There was a woman lived on the island many years ago who had pet wallabies. When she died, the wallabies went wild. They didn't go insane. What I mean is there was no longer any fences keeping them in. There was no longer anyone feeding them. They just started breeding and living off the local vegetation. And you can go to this abandoned island. Me and Callum rode out there in a boat. It's in a lake, Loch Lomond, so it's like a freshwater lake, loch.
Mm-hmm.
And walking around, we couldn't find anything during the day, but walking around the island at night with just a couple of little torches, suddenly you see all these little eyes, and then something hops through the undergrowth. And we've got a little video. You can see it on Ghastly Tales YouTube channel. We've got a video of when we went there, and there's just something eerie about it being in this Scottish forest. and a pair of eyes watching you, and then
From the other side of the world.
a kangaroo-like thing comes jumping out. Nothing terrifying, but there's something uncanny about it.
Yeah.
That's hard to put your finger on.
Yeah.
And that's not even a dangerous animal. That's just something that shouldn't be there.
Yeah. Well, away from alligators from now, here's another urban legend. This one is about a nice couple on their honeymoon booking into their hotel room. The hotel isn't exactly the Ritz, but it's all they could afford for a few days, and so they're happy. Once in their room, they dim the lights, they get their groove on, and then pass out after drinking a bottle of cheap sparkling wine they pretend is champagne. In the morning, they wake up, and the couple both notice a smell in the room. It's a musky, sweet smell. At first, it isn't overpowering, and they reckon it's just some flowers that have been left out a little too long in a nearby room, but a day later, it's really starting to stink. A few hours after that, and the stench is so putrid, they can hardly stay in the room without throwing up. When they realise that the smell is coming from the bed, the husband and wife lift up the mattress. Through the coiled metal springs of the bed frame, they see two eyes staring up at them. But they are not eyes of an animal, they are of a human being. A human body, to be precise, quite dead, bloated and bruised. So there have been quite a few iterations of this urban legend. Most of them take place in Las Vegas, but some of the stories even mention a Disney resort. In each telling, a body is found in the room eventually, usually under the bed. The idea of sleeping on top of a dead body is creepy, but it gets worse when you realise that this is something that happened in the past and continues happening to this day.
Yeah.
In the urban legend book, The Baby Train, Jan Harold Brunvard explores this urban legend and claims that it first grew popular in the early 1990s. There's no single case that has given rise to this tale, but the earliest one I could find was on Snopes and was from 1982. It also involved a serial killer, Richard Kuklinski, who I think we've mentioned before. Kuklinski and an accomplice, Daniel Deppner, decided to kill a man named Gary Smith. Smith was part of their burglary gang, and the police were starting to close in on the identity of their group. Kuklinski ordered Smith to lay low, and so he rented Smith a room at the York Motel in New Jersey. But Smith didn't stay in his room. He left to go and visit his daughter. Kuklinski, who we know now had no issue with killing anyone who angered him, decided that Gary Smith should be killed for being a liability, but also because Kuklinski grew paranoid that Smith would become an informant. The reason for this was that he had talked about leaving his life of crime behind. Pretty tragic that the guy wanted to go clean.
Yeah.
Kuklinski put cyanide in Smith's burger and then, before he died, strangled him. Gary Smith's body was supposed to be taken away by Daniel Deppner's ex-wife, but she did a runner. So they put Gary Smith's body between the mattress and the box spring in the room. After they left, the room was rented by a few different people over 4 days, but they complained about the smell. Finally, on the 27th of December 1982, Gary Smith's body was found. Ironically, according to forensic pathologist Michael Baden, if Kuklinski hadn't strangled Smith and had just left him to die from the cyanide, his death would probably have been recorded as a drug overdose, and no one would have known he was murdered.
These cyanide addicts, man.
Yeah, I'm assuming it's because of the man's previous history and just the time that would have happened, and I'm assuming...
And maybe how long he's been lying there for. There's no way to test for it, maybe after a certain length of time.
Maybe, yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
It's interesting as well, though, because, like, yet again, we're coming to an urban legend that hinges on... Obviously, this did happen, right? But what makes this urban legend such ripe material for spreading and for being retold and for grabbing people's imagination? Yet again, it's something that it's based around people's anxiety of a business or a profession, in this case, a hotel or a motel, that involves a situation where we feel vulnerable when we're alone in private, sleeping at night or spending time in a room. But it's a room and a space that's been shared by hundreds of people before you. It's not a familiar place that you're sleeping.
Yeah.
You don't know who has access to it. So again, like a barber, like people who sell food. I think like a hotel or a motel is prime fertilizer, if you like, for
you're at your most vulnerable.
These kinds of really eerie urban legend. Yes, it's a situation where you're vulnerable. So I think that will always be prime real estate for great urban legends.
Yeah. There are several other similar stories that could have all led to this becoming an urban legend in the early 90s.
Yeah.
One involved the death of a man who I believe sadly remains unidentified to this day. That part of the story haunts me. The man was in a motel with his partner. He swallowed 34 balloons filled with heroin. This was a common way to smuggle drugs, and it still is. You swallow the drug in a balloon or condom and just pray that it doesn't burst before you expel it in the toilet later. Unfortunately for this man, one of the balloons burst while inside of him and he died from an immediate overdose.
Massive overdose, yeah.
His partner put the body under the bed in the motel room and then left. A family were rented the room shortly after and they complained about the smell, leading to the discovery of the man. It makes me really sad when anyone dies and no one knows their name. I do wonder as well about how the body was discovered. The report on this said it was a family, and I just hope it wasn't a kid that found the body. Slight tangent again, everyone. We're doing it a lot tonight into stories of Michael. When I was a kid, I fell off some rocks along a stretch of coastline. It was just about like a 4 or 5 foot drop.
Where was it?
I can't remember exactly where it was, but I think it was in Scotland.
Right.
But it's a memory that's always really stayed with me. But I fell and then I was on the rocks and I was on my front.
Yeah.
And when I opened my eyes, I could see into this dark patch underneath the rock face. It was like a sort of overhang.
Uh-huh.
It looked like a sort of large hole. Inside of it was a massive dead crab, and it was just like a few inches from my face. But I remember it being huge. I probably made it bigger in my mind than what it actually was, but that's always stayed with me. And when I read this story, you know, I don't know why that jumped into my head, but the idea, I mean, imagine what it's like finding a human body under similar circumstances. I'd imagine that.
I wonder whether that would be worse or better for a child, because like I feel like as a kid, like playing with my friends, I was always like, I wonder if there's a body in there, or I wonder if that guy's a spy. You kind of have this, you live in this sort of semi-mythical world, so you almost wonder if a kid would be better at dealing with something like that than maybe not. Maybe
you found a body, like, that's fine, but you never want to find a crab, mate. You never want to find a crab.
Aye. That's true. Body can't hurt you. A giant crab can.
Johnny found a crab. He's never been the same since. One last case linked to this urban legend is the Jerry Lee Dunbar murders. He killed 2 women in Virginia back in 1989. So in 2 different motel rooms, he hid a body under his bed and then under the floor of the room. In one instance, Dunbar kept the body of 27-year-old Deirdre Smith underneath the bed on which he slept for days.
Ugh.
He then moved her body under the floor of the room and stayed there for 3 or 4 weeks.
Jesus.
The bodies in both rooms were only discovered by later guests, as per this urban legend.
Do you think that was just to hide the body, or do you think that was kind of like a necrophiliac angle, or
to be able to do that,
this
possibly.
Bizarre.
There are so many urban legends that have at least a grain of truth to them. As I said, we'll probably record a few of these episodes over the years, as I have a list of cases we can go through with each, and I'm sure, Martin, you could find a ton as well. So before we go, however, let's do one last urban legend.
Yes, do one more.
Just before the sun comes up. I spoke at the beginning of this episode about the cosy feeling that urban legends gave me and continue to give people all over the world. Spooky stories that are real enough to give us that little glimpse into the real dangers of the world. But some of the real events that inspire these harmless stories are truly stomach-churning. Have you heard of the House of Blood urban legend, Martin?
You'll need to start telling me. I'm not familiar with the title, but I feel like it's one of these things I'll probably know when I start hearing the story.
Okay, so it's an urban legend that primarily spread across Australia in the last 15 years or so.
Right.
It's about a woman who decides to murder her husband.
Okay.
But she doesn't just want him dead, she wants to humiliate him even after being slaughtered. So the wife tells the husband that she's preparing a very special family meal for him and his 2 kids. She's the stepmother to those children. The wife wants the children to go upstairs and let her and the husband set the table and get things ready for what's going to be a very special night. She also tells the children to put on their Sunday best and to only come downstairs when called upon. The husband probably thinks at this point that he's getting some afternoon delight, but instead he's invited into the kitchen where the wife slits his throat. She has everything she needs in place. She mops up the blood and then skins the body of her husband before butchering the carcass and removing the meat. After cooking a lovely meal with what remains of her husband, she calls the children down. There, she explains that their father wasn't feeling very well and went to bed. She then watches in glee as the dead father's children eat their own dad, enjoying every bite. It's something straight out of Tales from the Crypt, worse than that actually, but it's also a true story. Back in February of 2000, Catherine Knight took brutal revenge on John Price for kicking her out of their home. Incidentally, he kicked her out because she'd stabbed him. So
sounds like a stand-up lass.
Pretty good reason for kicking anyone out. But soon after, Catherine bought some sexy lingerie and managed to persuade John to let her back into the house. They had sex and John fell asleep. At some point during the night, Catherine stabbed John with a butcher's knife while he was sleeping. You see, Catherine worked in an abattoir, so she knew what she was doing.
Yeah. Oh, God.
John awoke in absolute terror and ran out of the house, but Catherine most probably pulled him back inside at this point. They know this by blood that they found outside of the house.
I feel like maybe I've heard this case on like something like Case File podcast or something like that.
It's one of the worst
Australian ones.
It's really, That was when he bled to death. The autopsy revealed that he was stabbed 37 times. After this, Catherine left the house and withdrew $1,000 from Price's bank account. She then came home and skinned his body. As I said, she worked in an abattoir. Catherine hung the skin from a meat hook, decapitated John, and then cooked some of his body, serving up the meat with baked potato, pumpkin, beetroot, zucchini, cabbage, yellow squash and gravy. She then set the dining table for two. Besides the plates were name cards where she had written the names of John's two children. What was left of the corpse she posed in the house with John's left arm draped over an empty 1.25 litre soft drink bottle and with his legs crossed. Catherine also wrote a note on a photograph of John which seemed to imply that John had raped Catherine's daughter. This was later found to be untrue.
Jesus.
Maybe she was trying to come up with an extenuating circumstances for later in court. Thankfully, the meal was never served to John's kids, thank God.
Right.
In fact, it was John himself that stopped that horrendous thing from happening. You see, the day before, John had told his co-workers that if he didn't come into work, they should assume that Catherine had killed him. So when he didn't come...
That doesn't sound like a healthy relationship.
No. When he didn't come home from work, one of his co-workers visited the house. The co-worker encountered a neighbour of John's who was also worried, and they together phoned the police. The police broke down the door to the house and found John's remains next to Catherine, who had gone to sleep after taking some sleeping pills.
Yeah.
If you're wondering where the kids were, Catherine had deliberately sent them to a sleepover so that she could kill their father and then serve him to them for dinner when they returned. Catherine was found guilty of murder, and due to the horrendous nature of her crimes, the judge gave her life imprisonment with a note on her papers that stated she should never be released. This was the first time that had ever happened for a female prisoner in Australia. So as you can see, some of the urban legends that came from it changed over time, and that's fascinating in a way how these stories alter. But it's a horrendous crime. So what do you think, Martin? You have any urban legends you want to share?
Another one that sort of occurs to me for this is, have you ever heard the legend of Charlie No Face?
Yeah. I was going to include that in this, but I left it out.
Ah, right, okay. Well, just to briefly touch on it, this was a kind of urban legend that went around in Pennsylvania. It was a long-term urban legend in a small town that in the town at night, a man with no face would walk the streets, and this was like a boogeyman figure for local children. Turns out it was 100% true. It was a guy called Raymond Robinson who, as a boy, fell from a tree into an electrical line and lost his eyes and nose.
Oh, it's awful.
But he lived his whole life. He was an elderly man at this point. But one of his sort of few joys, I guess, was going a walk. But he always took his walks at night, not because he was going out and being scary and lurking around, but simply because he wanted to avoid causing a panic, because this is a guy with no eyes and nose. You know, he's quite a striking and potentially disturbing sight for people. There's actual photographs of the guy. You know, he really does and did exist, and it is a sad story. But again, you know, it goes to show that 99% of times they are just stories that play well with our anxieties, our fears, our preoccupations. But every so often, there's some real information buried away in these stories, and it's fascinating stuff.
As and I've lost my voice. So I do find urban legends fascinating, and like I say, there are a whole ton of these that we could discuss. Some obscure, some well known, that have at least elements of them are based on real things that happened. And I would love to get into that at some point, Martin. But before we go, again, thanks to everyone for listening. And just a reminder that if you do want to support the show, please do join our Patreon, and there'll be a link in the show notes below.
Help us out with a review as well.
Yeah.
You don't have to support us financially. You can support us by writing a review. You can support us by saying hello on Twitter or giving us a retweet. Or if you've got any friends who you think might be interested in the kind of weird things that we discuss, maybe share the podcast with them. All of that is fantastic support. Yeah,
reviews especially helpful for the podcast growing. So but do you know what, if you just take the time to listen to us, that's more than enough. Thanks.
Exactly.
We really do appreciate it. But Martin, I think the sun is coming up.
I thought that was the sun.
Pretty sure it's the sun. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Sleep tight.
Don't let the corpse under the bed bite.
At some point during the night, Catherine stabbed John while he was sleeping with a butcher's knife. Sorry. Oh, he was sleeping with a butcher's knife. Sorry. Fucking hell. Hang on.